Ever since I was a child, I dreamed of having my own business. I wanted to create a small but successful company. My vision of an ideal life included a wonderful wife and 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. I always thought this would give me meaning and purpose in life. However, as is often the case, life presents us with serious challenges. One evening, all my dreams were shattered. I found my wife and her lover in the kitchen. They wanted to talk to me. My name is Jeffrey Mason, and I have always aspired to run my own business. My father has supported me in this since I was a child. He believed in me more than I believed in myself. I remember our conversations in the kitchen of our home. It was filled with the aromas of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee. My father would tell me stories of his youth, of traveling and discovering new cultures through food and drink. These stories inspired me to dream of having my own cafe. I envisioned it as a place where people could gather and feel at home. After graduating from college, armed with knowledge and enthusiasm, I decided it was time to make my dream a reality. My father was my support and mentor. Not only did he provide me with the startup capital he had accumulated over the years, but he also gave me something more valuable: confidence and a belief in success. The first few months on the job were incredibly challenging. I worked without a day off, starting early in the morning and ending late at night. Despite the fatigue, I felt incredibly energized. I was doing something important, something of my own. Our efforts began to bear the first fruits. As soon as the cafe started to make a profit, my father decided that now I should manage on my own. A year after opening, my cafe began to bring in a modest but steady income. Finally, I was able to relax a little and let myself not only work, but also enjoy life. One of those days, Jane came into my life. Our meeting happened quite by chance. I decided to take a break and take a walk in the park near the cafe. That day was bright, sunny, with a slight breeze. Jane was sitting on a bench reading a book. As I walked by, I noticed the wind had torn a page out of her book. I rushed over to help her catch the flying leaf, and so our conversation began. She thanked me and we began chatting about books, our favorite genres. A discussion of cultural preferences led to a conversation about the importance of taking breaks sometimes and savoring the moments. After learning that she was a law school student, I was amazed at her intelligence and wit. We spent the entire evening in the park sharing stories from our lives. From that day on, our friendship only grew stronger. We began to see each other more and more often and spend time together. I soon realized that I couldn't imagine my life without her. Jane not only supported me in everything about the cafe, but also inspired me to grow as a person. I appreciated her for her kindness, her intelligence, and her ability to see things in me that I didn't see in myself. A few months later, after realizing the depth of my feelings, I proposed to her. The venue was my cafe. Since I didn't have much money, we decided to organize a wedding and buy a house on credit. I was sure that I would be able to pay off my debts based on the success and stability of our cafe. There came a turning point in our life together when Jane received a job offer she could not refuse. Roger Novak, a young and ambitious lawyer who was known to us through mutual friends, offered Jane to be his assistant. At the time, Roger was just starting his practice and was looking for talented people to build a successful team. Jane was delighted with the offer. She saw it as a great opportunity for personal and professional growth. Although I felt that our business was doing well enough that Jane could be out of work, she wanted to contribute to the family budget and grow in a new field. I supported her decision, seeing how enthusiastically she accepted the challenge. Roger Novak proved to be an impressive person, intelligent, driven, and charismatic, which attracted people. In the first few months on the job, Jane often told me about her successes and how much she was learning. The job was time-consuming, but she was happy and full of energy. I loved to see how she was inspired by the new ideas and challenges Roger set for her. Sometimes I thought she spent too much time at work, but I knew it was important to her. Working with Roger brought her a sense of fulfillment and success. I didn't want to take that away. Jane and I had always been a team, and I knew it was important to support each other in our endeavors. Despite my small misgivings about her new job, I tried to be a pillar of support for her. Our ability to support and inspire each other over time only strengthened our bond. Over time, I began to notice changes that at first seemed insignificant. Jane began to spend less and less time at home. I realized that her work was taking up not only her time, but also the energy we could be spending together. Evenings when we sat down to dinner, discussing the day and sharing plans for the future became rare. Jane often came home late, tired, and the only thing she wanted was some quiet time. I tried to be supportive of Jane, cooking dinner and helping around the house. However, there was a growing distance between us that only grew with time. Our conversations about the future and shared dreams were replaced by short messages about having to stay late at work or sudden business meetings. When I tried to talk about how much I missed our evenings together, Jane would often talk about the importance of her work and how meaningful it was to her. I tried to understand and accept this, but in my heart I began to feel resentful and lonely. In addition, I noticed that Jane became more reserved and detailing about her work. Whereas previously she had enthusiastically shared every detail, now her stories became more general and vague. Sometimes it seemed to me that she avoided talking about her work, especially when I asked questions about her meetings with Roger. One evening, when Jane came home late again, I decided to discuss the subject. I asked her if she was spending too much time at work and if we should try to find a work-life balance. Jane's answer surprised me. She said that work had given her the opportunity to grow and that I should realize that. Her words sounded reasonable, but the tone in which they were said deepened the sense of distance between us. Over time, her boss, an attorney, rose to great heights and became the best in our town. He bought a house and drove an expensive SUV. To be honest, I even envied him because I felt stuck in my business and was not experiencing the growth I had experienced earlier. I'd really missed the support of Jane, who seemed to be distancing herself from me more and more. I tried to start a conversation about children, thinking that a child in the family would give me more motivation to grow. But Jane said she didn't want to rush into it. Time passed and it was a normal day. I closed the cafe later than usual. After talking to the last customers, who had become almost like friends over the years, I headed home. My mind was spinning with ideas about suggesting to Jane that we spend the weekend together, maybe go somewhere to feel close to each other again. As I approached the house, I noticed that the light was on in the living room, which was unusual since Jane usually came home late. As soon as I unlocked the door and entered, Jane was sitting in the kitchen at the glass table. Her face expressed seriousness and weariness, but what surprised me most was the presence of a third person. It was Roger Novak. He sat across from her and looked as if his being here was the most normal thing in the world. "We need to talk," Jane began, addressing me. Her tone was calm, but there was a confidence in it that alarmed me. Roger nodded at me in greeting, but didn't say a word himself. Jane continued, and every word hit me like freezing rain. She talked about how our relationship had changed, about feeling lost between work and home, and about finding comfort and understanding in Roger. She didn't mention the word affair, but every phrase was imbued with it. Then, as if from a distance, I heard her request for a divorce. On the table in front of me were papers neatly folded and ready to be signed. In that moment, the world around me froze. I couldn't believe this was happening to me and to us. My first impulse was to dismiss her words and say that we could fix this, that we should try again. But Jane's look was determined, and Roger's presence spoke volumes. Roger intervened in his calm and confident voice. He didn't offer an apology or try to soften the blow. Instead, he talked about the practicalities of how it would be best for all of us. His words sounded cold and calculating, and there wasn't a hint of regret in his eyes. I sat there, unable to rise, trying to comprehend how my life and dreams were crumbling before my eyes. Questions swirled around in my head, but I couldn't get a word out. Jane asked me to sign the papers, but everything in me resisted the decision. In desperation and rejection of this reality, I could not sign the papers. Finally, when I found the strength to speak, my voice shook, but I tried to remain calm, even though a storm was raging inside. Jane looked at me with regret in her eyes, but her resolve did not waver. "Jeffrey, please understand, this is the best decision for both of us," she said quietly, trying to convince me. But how could I understand? How could I agree that our shared life memories and dreams could be erased with the stroke of a pen? Roger stood up. The expression on his face was impassive. "Jeffrey, I don't want this to sound like a threat, but if you don't sign these papers voluntarily, we're going to have to deal with this matter through the courts. And believe me, Jane has a good chance of winning the case." His words were cold, and I realized he wasn't going to back down. He was willing to go all the way to the end to get the outcome he wanted. "I won't sign. I repeated firmly, trying to look Roger straight in the eyes, looking for a hint of understanding or sympathy. But there was nothing there, just cold calculation. Then we'll have to do it on the hard way. I know how much you value your business, don't I? Roger said calmly, putting down the papers and standing up from the table. He nodded to Jane and she stood up, heading with him toward the exit. I watched from the window as they crossed the street and got into Roger's Jeep, leaving me alone in my house. The next morning after that unforgettable and painful evening, I woke up with a heavy heart. The night had been restless, my sleep interrupted, filled with anxious thoughts of the future. The first thing I decided to do was to seek legal help. I needed someone who could objectively assess my situation and suggest possible courses of action. I remembered Mr. Osborne, an experienced lawyer specializing in family law, who had once been mentioned by friends. Without hesitation, I dialed his number and an appointment was made for the same day. Mr. Osborne welcomed me into his office with a professional smile, but his expression quickly turned serious as I began to explain my situation. He listened intently, interrupting me only to clarify details. After I finished, he paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. "Jeffrey, your situation is difficult, but not hopeless," he began, his tone expressing confidence. "First of all, we need to gather evidence that the divorce was initiated through no fault of your own. This will help protect your interests in court." I nodded, realizing that wasn't going to be easy. The idea of gathering evidence against Jane was very difficult. Mr. Osborne had suggested hiring a private investigator named Ive who could help with the case. "This is standard practice in such cases," he explained. "We must be fully prepared for a trial." At Mr. Osborne's office, I was somewhat reassured by this. I took the detective's number, but decided to call him a little later as I needed time to think things over. After meeting with Mr. Osborne, I went to a coffee shop and had my usual work day. In the evening, I drove to my empty house. I had just parked my car and was heading for the door of my house when I saw a figure standing in the shadows by my porch. My heart raced as I recognized the man as Roger Novak. His presence here at this hour was the last thing I expected. "I expected us to have a conversation, Jeffrey," he said, stepping out of the darkness. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying threat in his tone. I stopped, ready for a confrontation. "No, Roger, there is nothing more to discuss. Everything will be decided in court," I replied firmly, trying to hide my excitement. Roger stepped closer, his gaze stern and unyielding. "You're making a big mistake by refusing to sign those papers, Jeffrey. It could backfire on you in a most unpleasant way," he said. I could feel the anger rising in me. "Threats won't make me change my mind. I will fight for what I believe is right," I said, feeling my resolve strengthen in the face of his threats. Roger grinned, but there was no warmth in his smile. "Let's see what you say when this is all over, Jeffrey. Look at you, you're a loser. I always knew Jane would leave you. She talked about your successful cafe and how you were drowning in debt. She doesn't need you. What are you fighting for, clown?" He said those words with such narcissism, and they struck me so deeply that I couldn't help myself. "I'm fighting for my honor." With those words, I punched Roger right in the face, causing him to recoil and cover his face with his hands. I then threw a second punch right into his stomach, causing him to bend in half. "Stop it, what are you doing?" Roger began to yell. I threw a third punch, warning, "Don't you dare come near my house again." Roger hurriedly ran to his car. I was shocked that Roger had taken my wife, most likely slept with her, and yet dared to threaten me. I had always been calm, but now it felt like someone else had possessed me. The next morning, I called the detective and we set up a meeting in his office for lunch that afternoon. He introduced himself as Mr. Clark, a middle-aged man with a shrewd eye and a businesslike attitude. I told him my situation, trying to set aside emotion and be as accurate as possible in the details. Mr. Clark listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "We can start by observing Novak and trying to gather information about his interactions with your wife," he suggested after I finished. "That would help us get evidence that could be used in court." I nodded, agreeing with his plan. We discussed the details, including the potential risks and the cost of his services. Although the price was high, I realized the stakes in this game were even higher, so I didn't hesitate to agree. "I'll do my best to help you, Mr. Mason, and I'll try to get the material together in the next few days," Mr. Clark assured me. As we concluded our meeting, driving home, I reflected on how my life had turned into something akin to a detective novel, where every move could have unpredictable consequences. However, I was willing to go all the way to protect what I held dear, even if it meant playing by rules I didn't like. A few days after I hired Mr. Clark, my life fell into a rhythm of waiting. Every day I opened the cafe, trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to the possible outcome of the detective investigation. I tried to stay strong, but my inner restlessness kept me going. It was on these days that I felt most vulnerable. One day, while I was working in a coffee shop, something happened that I least expected. Roger Novak came up to me. He wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a man who seemed to be his bodyguard. Seeing Roger in my cafe, especially after our last conversation, the atmosphere was instantly filled with tension. "We need to talk, Jeffrey, somewhere quiet," Roger began. His voice sounded calm, but there was obvious determination in his eyes. I felt anger begin to rise within me. "I already told you, Roger, our conversation is over. It will be settled in court," I replied, trying to keep my cool. He only smirked in response, and then his gaze grew harder. "Do you really think you can win? I'm offering you one last chance to avoid public humiliation," he said. I declined his offer, feeling my patience breaking. "Your threats don't scare me, Roger. Leave my cafe," I said clearly and firmly. What happened next unfolded with incredible speed. I turned away to call my office security, at which point Roger pounced on me. He threw me to the ground and began beating me, yelling, "Did you little puppy think you could beat me up and get away with it?" He was like a dog off the chain and continued to beat me for about 40 seconds. I barely had time to realize what was happening, trying to fight back. The bandit he brought into my cafe prevented me from doing so. In the end, I was lucky that a patrol car was parked next to my cafe, and the police quickly came to my rescue, apprehending the enraged lawyer. Roger and I were taken to the police station, where I was victimized, and Roger tried to claim that I had attacked first. However, witnesses and camera footage proved otherwise. I was released and Roger was kept at the station and forbidden from approaching me. A few days after the attack, Mr. Clark contacted me, saying he had important information. We met in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. He pulled out of his briefcase some photographs and documents that he thought might be key to the case against Roger Novak and prove his wrongdoing towards me and Jane. The photographs depict informal meetings between Jane and Roger, which in itself is not direct evidence of infidelity, but does confirm my suspicions and could be used to support my case for the breakdown of the marriage due to outside interference. Mr. Clark has gathered evidence indicating that Roger has used his influence to put pressure on me and my business activities. These actions could be interpreted as an attempt to harm my well-being. "Jeffrey," Mr. Clark said, handing me the documents, "they could play a key role in your case by proving that Mr. Novak's actions were intended to destroy your marriage and threaten your business." I perused the materials provided and felt a surge of strength and confidence. Finally, I had something that could help me fight for justice. I thanked Mr. Clark for his work and asked him to keep following Roger in hopes of gathering more evidence of his guilt. Preparing for the trial occupied all my thoughts and time, but unfortunately Jane never once contacted me in all those days. This hurt me, yet I realized that I was already losing this man with each day approaching the hearing date. I felt a mixture of determination and anxiety. Working at the cafe had become a source of income for me, but also a refuge from personal storms. However, I knew that I could not allow my personal problems to affect my professional life. Since our last meeting, Mr. Clark continued to provide me with additional evidence and information that could be used in court, since Jane and I were still legally married. Pictures of her kissing another man would be substantial evidence of her infidelity. On the eve of the trial, I felt emotionally and physically drained. Gathering evidence, endless discussions with Mr. Clark, and struggling internally with my own feelings had taken its toll on me, but I knew I couldn't afford too much. I was determined to see the case through, regardless of the outcome. The day of the court hearing came sooner than I expected. I felt both prepared and completely unprepared for the events to come. Mr. Osborne assured me that we had done everything we could to prepare. He explained in detail the trial process and what arguments would be presented to defend my position. Upon arriving at the courthouse, I was overcome with a mixture of excitement and tension. The hallways were full of legal hustle and bustle, but for me, the world seemed to stop waiting. In the courtroom, I saw Jane and Roger for the first time in months. Jane looked calm, which added to my nervousness. Roger, as always, looked confident. When the hearing began, I tried to concentrate on every word spoken by the judge and the lawyers. Mr. Osborne effectively laid out our arguments, highlighting Roger's misconduct and its impact on my personal and professional life. He also drew attention to my wife's infidelity during our marriage. The evidence we presented included photographs and witness statements. However, when it was Jane's attorney's turn to speak, my anxiety increased. He presented his version of events in an attempt to portray Jane in the most favorable light and justify her decision to file for divorce. Jane claimed that I had used physical force against her and she had been forced to leave for her employer. It was hard to listen to this as they were trying to justify actions that had caused me so much pain. I just wanted to get a divorce and forget the whole thing like a bad dream. The days of waiting for the court's decision seemed endless. Every phone call made my heart sink waiting for news. Time passed, but I never heard from Mr. Osborne. My life seemed to stand still, and I tried to occupy myself with work in the cafe to take my mind off the obsessive thoughts of the trial. Finally, one clear fall day, as the leaves were beginning to yellow and fall, the bell rang. It was Mr. Osborne. His voice, as always, sounded firm and calm, but I felt at once that he was carrying important news. "The court has rendered its decision, Geoffrey," he began, and my heart beat faster. "The court has found our side's arguments to be sound. Your marriage to Jane will be dissolved at your request based on the evidence we have provided of her guilt in destroying the marital relationship." I froze, trying to catch every word, afraid of missing something important. "What about Roger?" I asked, barely catching my breath. "As for Mr. Novak, the court has ruled in your favor. He will be granted a restraining order against contact with you, and he will also be required to pay you compensation for emotional distress and court costs. The compensation will be substantial," Mr. Osborne continued. Those words felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off me. I felt a sense of relief mixed with the bitterness of knowing that this process had finally ended my relationship with Jane. But at the same time, I felt satisfaction that justice had been served. "Thank you, Mr. Osborne. I couldn't have done it without your help," I said, feeling my voice shake with excitement. "I'm glad I could help, Geoffrey. If you have any more questions or need additional help, know that I am always at your service," Mr. Osborne replied. After a few parting words, we ended the conversation. As I hung up the phone, I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to comprehend everything that had happened since that evening when my wife, or rather now ex-wife, had decided to bring her lover into our home and insist on an amicable divorce. In the end, Jane was unable to get anything from me. She betrayed me and slandered me, which left her in debt to me. Jane and Roger were out of work because after the incident at the cafe when Roger attacked me, he lost his position and could no longer practice his profession. I don't know how they are doing now, but clearly worse than me. I saw Roger driving some cheap foreign car instead of his Jeep, which looked pathetic, but I didn't care. I decided to get my life together. The first step toward a new life was deciding to sell the house that Jane and I had once picked out together. Selling the house turned out to be not as difficult a task as I originally thought, thanks to favorable conditions in the real estate market. I soon found a buyer. The proceeds from the sale of the house gave me financial freedom and the opportunity to look at my life from a new angle. I decided that the first thing I would do was to upgrade my car, which had served me well for many years. But most importantly, I decided to invest in the development of my cafe. This place became not just a business for me, but a part of my soul. In the cafe, I found solace in the most difficult times. I realized that I wanted to make it even more cozy and hospitable place where people would come for warmth and comfort. Renovating the cafe rejuvenated me, putting so much heart and soul into the place. I saw my life in a new light. Every new guest in my cafe and every positive review reminded me that even in the darkest of times, you can find light and hope for the best. Each day I realized more and more that reassessment and change are an inevitable part of life. They can be painful and scary, but they also offer the opportunity for growth and new beginnings. My cafe has become a symbol of such rebirth. It is a place where one can leave behind the difficulties of the past and find hope for a better future. I began to meet new people whose company brought me joy and inspiration. Each visitor to the cafe brought a story to tell, and I found pleasure in listening to their tales. These encounters reminded me that life is full of surprises and that even in the darkest of times, you can find sources of light. Now, looking ahead, I see a future full of possibilities. I plan to expand my business by opening new cafes in other parts of the city, and I am even thinking of creating my own product line. My ambitions and dreams that once seemed unattainable now seem like achievable plans. I know that new challenges will come my way, but I also know that I have the strength to overcome them. After all, every obstacle only makes us stronger, and every failure teaches us to appreciate our victories. And so we come to the end of this story. What do you think about the main character's reasons for cheating on his wife? Was it right on his part not to make concessions to his wife's lover and delay the divorce process? Discuss in the comments your opinion about the behavior of the main characters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like so that you don't miss new exciting stories. I look forward to your opinions and good luck in the discussions.
Thank you so much for watching my video and your time. Please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell button. Also, I am very interested to know your personal opinion about this story. You can write it in the comments. I will definitely answer you personally.